Really, I'm an independent investigative journalist, totally 100% self-funding. I've been in Syria. This is my third trip to Syria. I've been here this time for the last 2 weeks, and I've just returned from actually 5 days in total that I spent in East Aleppo, well, West Aleppo and Eastern Aleppo, but the majority of my time was spent in East Aleppo that has been recently liberated by the Syrian Arab Army from a Nusra Front-led occupation for the last 4 years of the eastern sectors of Aleppo. Now, when I say it's Nusra Front-led, there are probably estimated 22 brigades of militant and mercenary factions, including Nour al-Zinki, Arar Sham, Fastakim, and various others that all come under the leadership of either Nusra Front or ISIS, so under the leadership of designated terrorist factions. These factions have fundamentally imprisoned, incarcerated the Syrian people in the eastern districts of Aleppo for the last over 4 years. The testimonies that I received from the civilians after liberation by the Syrian Arab Army basically point to the fact that these terrorist-led factions starved the civilians. They were receiving humanitarian aid, both food and medicine and clean water, but all of these items were being withheld from the civilians. In many areas, the civilians were under rations. In other words, there was one family who had 12 members, and they told me that the terrorists basically gave them 12 loaves of bread every 3 days, and that was their entire food ration. Another lady that I spoke to in the area of Hanano that had been liberated 2 days before we got there, she told me that basically her 8-year-old daughter had been imprisoned by Nusra Front terrorists. And on the day of the Syrian Arab Army liberation, this 8-year-old daughter was killed. She also told me that her eldest daughter had been marked for rape by the Nusra Front terrorists. She was only saved from that fate by the liberation by the Syrian Arab Army. Many other such stories were circulating from the civilians that we met on the streets of Hanano in particular. Another person told me that basically when the civilians were trying to flee by the humanitarian corridors that were set up by the Syrian government and the Russians, the terrorists were firing upon the civilians, murdering them, preventing them from escaping. She told me of one woman who was starving, who went on her knees in front of the terrorists during one of these escape attempts from the district. And she told me that the terrorists shot this woman in the mouth. These are only one or two of the horrific accounts of life under the terrorist regime, basically, in Eastern Aleppo that we were told of. The other thing that was expressed by everybody that we spoke to in Hanano, people that had managed to escape from the old city, in Jibrin, which was the registration center where all of the internally displaced people from East Aleppo were coming to register prior to either going to families in West Aleppo or to going into the IDP camp in Jibrin itself. And we were told then that over 95,000 civilians from East Aleppo had already registered, plus another 10% of civilians that may have met with families directly and not come to the registration center. So we can count on about 100,000 plus civilians that had got out of East Aleppo and had come to Jibrin center to register, but also to receive medical care, food, hot drinks, all of which was being dispensed by the Syrian Arab Army and actually by Russian medics who had set up field hospitals in Jibrin itself to take care of people that we discovered had actually not received any medical treatment for the last 4 years under Nusra Front occupation. Now, this flies in the face of all mainstream media narratives. Of course, we've all been hearing about the last hospitals, the bombing of civilians in hospitals, the overriding testimony from these civilians that the West has been claiming to protect was that they never received any medical treatment. They were not allowed into these hospitals, whether they were official Aleppo Medical Association recognized hospitals or whether they were terrorist triage centers set up in the areas occupied by the militant factions led by Nusra Front. We were shown open wounds, healed over wounds that had never received any treatment and that were now finally receiving treatment via the Russian field hospitals that had been set up in Jibrin. And we saw one elderly gentleman in a wheelchair, and he basically told us, I mean, he was emaciated. Many of the children were emaciated, showing clear signs of malnutrition, skin diseases, all manner of sort of renal failure. We saw broken bones that had been left to heal without any form of setting, so that the bones had reset, completely crooked, twisted. And this elderly man in the wheelchair told us that he'd received no medical care for the entire 4 years that he'd been held as a prisoner in East Aleppo. Again, you know, what we're seeing here, in my opinion, is Aleppo representing a microcosm of what is happening in Syria. We see 75% of the population of West Aleppo, 1.5 million civilians in the West government-held area of Aleppo, being completely marginalized, dehumanized, ignored in Western media, ignored by the UN, ignored by the humanitarian organizations, and ignored liberally in the West, despite the fact that they have been under attack for those 4 years from the NATO and Gulf state-funded terrorist factions embedded in eastern Aleppo, using Hell Cannon, various manner of missile launchers to launch mortars, missiles, explosive bullets. Those came pretty close to us when we were in West Aleppo, which have completely eviscerated children, torn limbs from people, amputated limbs on children, destroyed lives and destroyed entire families for the last 4 years. Again, never talked about. Whereas the voices of the 25%, so the minority in East Aleppo, of the majority of which are actually foreign militants, armed militants and terrorist factions, their voices, not the voices of the Syrian civilians whose voices have also not been heard in East Aleppo until now, until their liberation, but the voices of the militant factions are the voices that have been amplified by our governments and our media. And this, as I say, is a reflection of what is going on in Syria. The majority voice of the Syrian people who support the Syrian government, the Syrian state, and the Syrian army, and are against any form of sectarian divisions that are being imposed upon them externally, their voices are being muted, ignored, marginalized, while the voices of the minority, of those who violently oppose the Syrian government, are being amplified. And we know now that the majority of the armed factions inside Syria are either foreign mercenaries funded by the Gulf states and NATO states. And the moderate rebels that existed in the very beginning, the Free Syrian Army, we know now they are such a tiny percentage. So again, there's very little amplification of the real Syrian voices speaking out for the real Syrian army and the real Syrian state. And the one thing that I would really like to counter here, there have been some, what I would consider truly obscene and grotesque reports from Western media, completely unverified. The UN has produced reports saying that they are unverified, but still nevertheless running with them, of the Syrian Arab army executing, massacring, raping, even in some cases, in some reports, the civilians in East Aleppo. This is grotesque, and I will explain why. The Syrian Arab army soldiers that we actually met inside East Aleppo, in Hanano, in the old city, in all the various areas in Sheikh Said that we visited, many of them are actually returning home. Many of them are coming back to their own homes in East Aleppo, where they grew up, where they went to school, where they had their friends and their families around them. To even suggest that these soldiers of the national army, it's not as if it's Assad's army. This is the national army of Syria. They are the sons, the brothers, the uncles, the daughters of the families of Syria. to even imagine that these people who I saw in tears to be able to actually see their families again, to see their homes again in the liberated areas, would execute their own families, their own children, their own brothers, their own sisters, their own fathers, their own mothers, is one of the most grotesque propagandist forms of reporting I've actually ever seen. And the fact that both the UN and Western media are basing these reports upon the accounts coming in from spurious organizations, such as, for example, the primarily British-funded White Helmets, who were trained, as we know, by an ex-British military mercenary set up in 2013, not in Syria, but in Turkey, and embedded in Nusra-held, Al-Qaeda-held, and ISIS-held areas across Syria, but particularly in East Aleppo. Much of the accounts coming out of Syria in the last 5.5 years have been based upon their reports. Now, when I spoke to civilians inside East Aleppo, many of them had never heard or seen of, had neither heard of nor seen the White Helmets. But others were actually more disturbingly telling me, which is what we have suspected, that they were a civil defense, but that they were working entirely with the terrorist factions, majority with Nusra Front or with ISIS. Lizzie Phelan on the ground, also in East Aleppo for RT, spoke to two people, one of whom said they did not take bodies out of the rubble. They actually left people under the rubble to die. And another man on Lizzie Phelan's report actually claimed that he had taken his baby girl into a White Helmet temporary field shelter for medical care. And he claimed publicly on TV that they had murdered his daughter. So this is not the neutral, impartial humanitarian organization that has been multi-million-dollar funded by NATO states and Qatar, Gulf states, who also are actively involved in funding the terrorist factions inside Syria, and not forgetting that our governments who are funding the White Helmets to the tune of over $150 million have also a declared interest in regime change in Syria. So what we're seeing now is a breaking down of the propaganda and the lies that have underpinned the illegal NATO state and Gulf state intervention via proxy terrorist military against the war that is being waged against Syria, is being shown and exposed to be the criminal intervention into a sovereign nation that it really is.